Let's go to Isaiah chapter 6, if you will, the book of Isaiah and chapter number 6. A familiar passage to many of us, I believe. But starting with verse 1, I'll read down to verse number 8, Isaiah chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain he covered his face, and with twain he covered his feet. With twain he did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The posts of the doors moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then flew one of the seraphims unto me, having a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with the tongs from off the altar. And he laid it upon my mouth, and said, Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me. There will be seasons in your life where you will wonder, where's God? There'll be times when your prayers will seem to go no higher than the ceiling of the room in which you pray them. It will seem that God has vacated his throne, that God is somehow absent from your life. My freshman year in college, I met a young lady. We began to form a friendship. We were not overly serious about each other. Both of us had made a commitment that we would finish college before we thought about getting married or anything like that, and that came out fairly quickly in our conversations. And so we were friends, and we would have an occasional date. By the time I got to my junior year, she was getting ready to graduate. She was a year and a half ahead of me in school and was preparing to be an elementary school teacher, and God had certainly equipped her for that task, and a church in Indiana had contacted her and asked her to come and teach in that Christian school. I still had a year and a half left. And over those months, we had talked about whether she and I were really God's will for each other. I mean, God was calling me to preach. He was calling me toward evangelism, and she felt passionate about teaching. And it just seemed like our paths were going in different directions, and it seemed if we were truly in the will of God, we couldn't possibly make that work. So we had talked about it a number of times, and one day after lunch, we got together and had a discussion again about it, and we decided that we should end our relationship. I went to an afternoon class. It was an upper-level speech class, and I always enjoyed that class. I knew everybody in there. We always had a lot of fun. But that day, I chose a seat over by the window, away from everybody else, because I couldn't stop crying. Now, I'm not a crier, but that day I couldn't stop crying. It just felt like there was a hole in my emotions. There was something missing in my heart. And I remember the teacher trying to teach, and he was looking at me like, what's wrong with you? But I felt like God had abandoned me, and I remember sitting there thinking, God, where are you? It was 1975. I was scheduled to preach 3 revival meetings in the city of Los Angeles. I'd never been to the state of California, much less the city of Los Angeles. And so 3 churches, 3 weeks in a row, and I got in my Volkswagen Beetle, and I began to drive across the country from the Midwest. No interstate highway, just a 2-lane road, 55 miles an hour, no air conditioning. And I drove, and I drove, and I drove, and I thought, my geography teachers lied to me. There is no Pacific Ocean. It does not exist. And I drove, and I drove, and I drove, and I finally crossed the state line into California. And I found Los Angeles. Now, we didn't have GPS. We had maps. Now, for you youngsters, that's a piece of paper with lines on it. And the lines represent roads, and you follow the lines, and it takes you to where you want to go. And I've got my map in my lap, and I'm trying to find the city of La Puente, right in the heart of Los Angeles. And I was zigzagging here and there through that city, and finally arrived at the church, and boy, I was just so happy to be anywhere. And I remember it was about 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and I pulled into that parking lot, and there was a man working in some flower beds, kind of sprucing some things up there, and I got out of the car, and I made my way over to him, and I introduced myself, and he introduced himself as the pastor. And after we introduced ourselves, he said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "Well, I'm here to hold a revival meeting." He said, "I don't know anything about that." I said, "Oh, well, nice to meet you." I got back in my car. And I remember driving down the street in front of the church, and I drove maybe 10, 12 blocks, thinking, what am I going to do? I had never been in Los Angeles before. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have a cell phone. Nobody did. I didn't have a credit card. Nobody did. I didn't have a debit card. Nobody did. I had $36 in my pocket. And I drove about 10, 12 blocks, and I came to what I affectionately call a flea bag hotel. There were actually 2 of them side by side. I picked the better looking of the 2, walked in, and a kind lady said, "How can I help you?" I said, "I think I need to see the manager." She picked up a phone and made a call, and pretty soon this nice gentleman came out. He said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "Well, I need to stay here in your town for the next 6 nights. I need a room." He said, "No problem." I said, "Well, there's one little problem." I said, "I only have $36. He paused for a moment, and he reached under that counter, and he pulled out a ring of keys. And he said, "Follow me." We went out a back door of that hotel into a courtyard area. Now, it's not what you're thinking. It was just a bunch of grass grown up and old beds and dressers of drawers stacked up there, just a bunch of junk. And we walked across that courtyard to an iron door that he opened with one of those keys, pushed it back, and we walked into a room about 12 by 12. It had a military cot with a mattress on it. It had a shower. It had a sink, it had a commode, and it had a metal folding chair. He said, "It's all yours, $6 a night." I gave him my $36, and he left. And as he closed the door, I noticed something out of my left peripheral, and I looked up, and above the door there was a little shelf, and on that shelf was a small television set. Now I remember thinking to myself, well, at least I have a TV. Now, I remember going over there and reaching up and clicking it on, and it was showing snow. A black background with snow blowing across the black background. And I'm from Wisconsin. I thought, I've seen all the snow I want to see. I want to see something different than that, so I turned the channel, and it was showing the same thing. In fact, all 13 channels were showing the same program, static. And I remember sitting on the edge of that bed thinking, Lord, where are you? It was 1982. I was now married, had 2 children. We were traveling together in a trailer. And we were to preach in Warrenville, Illinois, a western suburb of Chicago. We arrived at the church. I'd preached for the pastor before. He was a church planter. He didn't stay but about 2 or 3 years in a place. He'd plant a church, get it going, then he'd go to another town, and I'd been with him at a couple of other locations. What a wonderful man he was. Tremendously gracious, very humble, and a real soul winner. And he just loved planting churches. We pulled into his place there. He lived in a 3-story house. We backed our trailer in there and got everything set up. And we were renting an elementary school for the revival. And it was kind of like Murphy's Law. If it could go wrong, it went wrong. I mean, that whole week just was one problem after another problem. The janitor never showed up the entire week. We had to break in the building every night just to have the meeting. And just problem after problem. And the church was not growing. It was difficult to get people to come. And it was so unlike the churches he had started before. And I could tell that he was greatly discouraged. And I said to my wife about Wednesday, I said, you know, Pastor, he's really discouraged. She said, yeah, his wife's really down. They had 7 children, and you could tell the kids were not happy. And I said, you know, I don't know what the love offering will be this week. It probably won't be much. But God seems to be telling me that when we get to the end of the week, we ought to give the love offering back to the pastor. I think he needs it more than we do. Well, my wife said, that's what I've been thinking. Well, whenever she would say stuff like that, I'd say, well, let's pray about it for a couple of days. You know, it's not rushed any hasty conclusions. We prayed about that, and Friday night finally came, and nothing went any better the last 2 days. And Friday night after the service, he invited us to come in and have some popcorn with the kids and play some games, and we did that. And finally, he reached in his pocket and pulled out an envelope and handed it to me, and he said the normal things. Brother Goetsch, we did our best. We wish it could be more, but we did our best. And for the first time and the last time in my life, I opened that envelope in the presence of the pastor because I was going to sign the back of it and give it to him. And I opened that envelope and I pulled out that check, and I couldn't help but notice the amount. It was for $250. Now, in 1982, $250 was a lot of money. And it was an amazing amount of money for a week of revival meetings. I was shocked, but I already decided what I was going to do. And I turned it over and I signed it, and I said, Pastor, we want this to be for your family. Well, he tried to resist, and I forced him to take it, and he started crying, his wife started crying, all the kids started crying, and I got out of there. There's no sense hanging around that stuff. And you know, when you obey the Lord, you feel good about it, right? I mean, we went out, slept like a rock, got up the next morning. We were headed to St. James, Minnesota. And I had fuel on board, and we pulled out of Chicago, pulling that 16,000-pound trailer, and made it out of Chicago and up into Wisconsin, I-94, and went across over to La Crosse. We got to La Crosse, Wisconsin, and both of my fuel tanks were on empty. I still had over 100 miles to go. And I said, Lord, I don't have any gas. And the Lord said, well, pull over and get some. I said, well, that's easy for you to say. But I don't have any money. I gave all my money to the pastor in Chicago. I still didn't have a credit card or a debit card, anything like that. And the Lord said, pull over. I said, but God, I don't have any gas. I don't have any money. He said, pull over. Now, I had heard preachers tell stories about how they pulled into a gas station, filled their car up with gas, and someone else paid for it. I didn't have that kind of faith. I was operating on a cash basis. I said, Lord, I don't have any money. He said, you've got money. And he reminded me, in the trailer, we had bought the kids a little bucket to play in the dirt with, and the handle broke the first day, but they wanted to keep that bucket. It was kind of a fluorescent yellow color. They liked the looks of it, and we cleaned it up. And they were putting all of our pennies in that bucket. Every time we had pennies, they'd put in that bucket. And it was about 3/4 full. And God said, use that. I pulled into a gas station in La Crosse and bought 40 gallons of fuel with pennies. I will never forget the expression on the guy's face as he counted them 2 by 2 on that glass counter. Nor will I forget the expression of the 7 people standing behind me, waiting to buy their gas. But we miraculously got to St. James, Minnesota. Little church, clapboard building on the edge of town, 35 people, the youngest of which was 65 years old. Pastor was working 50 hours a week at the lumber yard to put food on his table. We got set up, met with the pastor, went over some of the plans, had prayer together Saturday night, went in Sunday, preached Sunday school, morning service. Nobody said anything about lunch. So we went out to the trailer. We had a few canned goods we threw together, made a little lunch, and I thought, well, they'll feed us tonight after the service. Service that night, pastor came up after. He said, well, I got to get up and go to work at 4 in the morning. He said, I'll see you tomorrow night at 7. We went to bed hungry. The next morning, I was out washing my rig down. I always like to get all that road grime off my truck and trailer on Monday mornings, and had my hose and my brush and all that, and I'm starting to work on that. And out around behind that trailer, I had a pity party. I said, God, you got us here, miraculously. And I don't mind fasting this week. But I got a wife and 2 kids in there. And if I don't take care of them, I've denied the faith and worse than an infidel. God, where are you? There will be seasons in your life where you'll wonder, where's God? I think Isaiah's there. The king has died. The nation is left without leadership. There's a void. There's a vulnerability. And Isaiah is wondering, God, what do we do? What's next? Where do we turn? We need help. You're going to find some times in your life where you'll wonder, where is God? And Isaiah, in this passage, in kind of a subliminal way, shows us 3 locations where we can always find God. Now, we know that he never leaves us nor forsakes us. We have that promise in Hebrews 13. But I think you'll agree with the songwriter Robinson, who said, we are prone to wander. Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. We're like sheep that wander away. And sometimes the distance between us and God seems impossible to cross. And we wonder, God, where are you? 3 locations where you'll always find God. First, God is always in the holy place. As Isaiah gets this vision of heaven, he sees the throne of God and these angelic beings called seraphims. They had 6 wings. With twain they covered their face, with twain they covered their feet, and with twain they did fly. And one of them in verse 3 begins to cry, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. God is always in the holy place. He's a holy God. And when God seems absent, we got to get back to the holy place. He told the nation of Israel, be holy, for I am holy. And holiness and unholiness can never coexist. We sometimes think, well, God loves me, God knows me, and I can live however I please. But the grace that saves us teaches us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and holy in this present world. God desires that we would be holy. Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, and they were not a church that were completely separated from the worldliness that surrounded them in Corinth. And he said in chapter 7, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, he said, put away, purge yourself. You need to put away and come back to the divine promises, perfecting holiness in the sight of God. Perfecting holiness. You know, the gentleman that sang a few moments ago, they didn't just walk up here and sing that. They practiced. The women who played the instruments tonight so beautifully, they didn't just decide, well, I think I'll play the piano tonight for the service. No, there was some practice involved, years and years, no doubt. How hard are we practicing holiness? We want to be a Christian that God can bless. We want God's power upon our life, but do we practice holiness? Paul said, be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? What communion hath light with darkness? What concord hath Christ with Belial? What part hath he that believeth with an infidel? What agreement hath the temple of God with the temple of idols, whose temple ye are? For God hath said, I'll dwell in them and be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore, come out from among them, be ye separate, saith the Lord. Touch not the unclean thing, and I'll receive you, and be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. Peter put it this way, you're a chosen generation. You're a royal priesthood. You're a holy nation. You're a peculiar people, and you should be showing forth the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which were not a people, but now are the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against your soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak evil among you, they may by your good works glorify God in the day of visitation. God desires his people to be holy. If we want God's presence and we want God's power and we want God's provision and we want God's protection, we've got to be in the holy place. But notice, secondly, the humble place. Now, we've already heard about that tonight. But look at Isaiah's response here when he sees the throne of God. He sees these angelic beings. His response in verse 5 was, woe is me, for I'm undone, because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. His response was one of humility. You know, God doesn't hang around his abominations. Everyone that is proud in heart is an abomination unto the Lord. Proverbs 16:5. These 6 things doth the Lord hate, ye 7 are an abomination unto him. A proud look. God doesn't hang around what he calls abominable. We've got to come back to the humble place. A place of humility. The Bible says in Psalm 138:6, though the Lord be high, he's about as high as you can go. You can't go any higher than God. Though the Lord be high, yet hath he respect unto the lowly. But the proud he knoweth afar off. If I were to ask you, who do you respect? Well, it would depend upon the context of our conversation, right? If we were talking about music, If I asked one of these ladies that plays these instruments, if I said, who do you respect as a piano player? Well, they would probably name someone, maybe a teacher of theirs, maybe a performer of some kind. They would respect somebody that's better than they are, someone that's a little bit farther along in their skill, has practiced longer than they have. We would look up to that person, right? If we're talking about sports, if you talk to a high school athlete and you say, who do you respect? They would probably point to a college athlete. A college athlete would point to a professional athlete. We're always looking up in the business model. If you asked a young businessman, who do you respect? They would point to some business and say, oh man, if I could be like that business, if I could serve people like that, if I could provide a service like they provide and do it with a smile and do it fairly, boy, I'd like to be like that company. We're always looking up. Who does God look up to? Though the Lord be high, yet hath he respect unto the lowly. God resisteth the proud. He gives grace to the lowly, to the humble. When I was a boy growing up in church, I used to hear preachers talk about a man named Paul Levine. They would talk about this evangelist. Sometimes they'd use him as an illustration about something, or they would talk about something he said or preached. And I remember as a boy thinking, I don't know who this Paul Levine is, but maybe someday I'll get to meet him. Maybe someday I'll get to hear him preach. And I grew up hearing this name from time to time. Paul Levine was saved in the state of Iowa at the age of 4 years old. He was called to preach at the age of 4. Don't ever underestimate what happens in that junior church back there. His mother said when he got called to preach at age 4, he would come home on Sundays and he would grab his little New Testament, jump up on the piano bench and start preaching. Paul Levine finished high school at age 15 and went into full-time evangelism. Began to travel all over Iowa, began to preach revival meetings. Couldn't drive a car, wasn't old enough. He hitchhiked, took public transportation. By the time Paul Levine was 17, he had a blind singer named Bob Finley that traveled with him, completely blind. And Paul and Bob would play their mandolins and they would sing and draw a crowd and Paul would preach. And God blessed the ministry of Paul Levine. All over the Midwest, upper Midwest, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. If you go to those states tonight and you mention Paul Levine, somebody's going to tell you, oh yeah, I got saved under Paul Levine. Paul Levine had a radio program called Bible Echoes out of Waterloo, Iowa. Preached the gospel for decades, 6 days a week on that station. He had an organization called Bible Tracts Incorporated that printed tracts in multiple languages and hundreds and thousands of tracts. That organization is still in existence. I was in a Flying J truck stop not long ago. I went into a stall and 2 tracts fell on the ground when I opened the door. One in English, one in Spanish, both printed by Bible Tracts Incorporated. An amazing man. And I thought, boy, I'd like to meet him one day. In 1981, I was preaching a revival in Danville, Illinois at the Faith Baptist Church. And one morning a knock came on the trailer door. It was the church secretary. We still didn't have cell phones. So if you got a call, the person that was trying to get in touch with you would call the church where you were preaching, and then you'd have to run in and take the call on the church phone. She said, you've got a call. I ran in the church, picked up the phone, and the voice on the other end of the phone said, Brother Goetsch, we've never met. He said, but I've heard about your ministry. He said, my name is Bill Rice III at the Bill Rice Ranch in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. He said, I don't know how much you know about the ranch. Well, I knew quite a bit about the ranch. I had heard Dr. John R. Rice when I was in college preach. I'd heard his uncle, Joe B. Rice, preach. I'd heard Bill Rice, his dad, preach. I heard Bill Rice III preach. I'd heard his brother Pete Rice preach. I knew about the ranch. I knew about the ministry, but I'd never met any of these people. And he said, as you know, we have youth weeks during the summer. Bill Rice Ranch was started in 1953. By Bill and Kathy Rice, who had a deaf daughter, and they bought a piece of ground outside of Murfreesboro, and they built the Bill Rice Ranch where deaf people could hear the gospel in sign language. But of course, they couldn't fill the camp every week with deaf people, and so they had hearing weeks as well. And every summer, they would start these youth weeks and add more and more as the years went by until they had 7 or 8 youth weeks every summer. And he said, we'd like to invite you to come for one of our youth weeks. And he gave me a date in 1983, 2 years down the road. And I had my schedule in front of me, and I looked at it, and I had that date open, and I said, I'd be honored to come. We got all the details down, and I floated back to my trailer. I was high as a kite. I thought, I get to preach at the Bill Rice Ranch. Now, it wasn't because there were going to be teenagers there. Paul Levine was going to be there. You see, the first teen week at the Bill Rice Ranch was held in 1953. And the first teen speaker was Paul Levine. And as those weeks grew, they added a second speaker to take some of the preaching responsibility off of Dr. Levine. And so those youth weeks had 2 speakers, and I was going to get to preach with Paul Levine. Man, I'm telling you, I look forward to that meeting. It finally came. I walked into that auditorium, the John R. Rice Auditorium, on that first evening through a side door. There were 1,400 teenagers sitting there. Not teenagers and sponsors and no, teenagers, 1,400 of them. All looking forward to that service. I didn't even look at them. All I could think about is, am I going to meet Paul Levine? Where is Paul Levine? I took a few steps in, and a man came over, and he stuck out his hand, and he said, welcome to the ranch, Dr. Goetsch. I'd never met him either. His name was Bill Rice III. And he welcomed me to the ranch. And he said, come up on the platform. I want you to meet Brother Paul. I thought, meet him now? Before the service? Whoa. I looked up on the platform, and it was a huge platform. And there was nothing on the platform except the pulpit, a piano, and a pew that stretched from one end of that platform to the other. It had to be about 30 feet long. And sitting on the edge of that pew on this side was Dr. Paul. I'd seen pictures of him. I thought, that's him? That's him. And he was sitting there, and he had his Bible open and a steno notebook hanging out of it. And he was writing notes in that notebook. And I thought, he's writing his sermon. He's preaching tonight. He's writing his sermon. By this time, Dr. Bill started going up the stairs, and I followed him. We got up on the platform, and Dr. Bill said, Brother Paul, I want you to meet John Goetsch. Dr. Paul closed that Bible, closed that notebook. He stood up, and he grabbed my hand with both of his hands. And he said, oh, Brother Goetsch. He said, I can't wait to hear you preach. I thought, hear me preach? I'm here to hear you preach. He said, here, sit by me, sit by me. Oh. I sat down that pew, and he reopened his Bible and that notebook and started writing some more of his message. I'm trying to read his handwriting. I can't read a thing. All through the preliminary song service, he's writing notes. And I could tell he's in a spirit of prayer. And finally, it came time for the sermon. And so Dr. Bill got up and he said, now, young people, tonight we get to hear Dr. Paul Levine. Dr. Paul's been preaching here since 1953. He's preached every youth week we've ever had. He said, Dr. Paul, how many sermons have you preached here at the ranch? Dr. Paul was still writing his message. He wasn't even listening to the introduction. But he heard his name and his head popped up and he said, 1,210. And Dr. Bill said, think of that, young people, 1,210 times this man that you're going to hear tonight has preached right here in this pulpit to teenagers just like you. And he went on introducing them, and Dr. Paul, he punched me in the ribs. And he said, I really don't know how many times I preached. He said, all I know is I ran out of sermons a long time ago. That was Dr. Paul. One of the most humble men I've ever met. We were together at the ranch one year, and the week wasn't going real great. The kids were a little bit hard. It was his turn to preach on a Thursday night. And he was sitting there like he always did, and he always wanted me to sit next to him. He's writing his sermon, praying, writing his sermon. And the special music was going on. He was next. He'd already been introduced. And I knew he was burdened, and I just kind of lightly reached over and touched his knee, and I said, Dr. Paul, I'm praying for you. He leaned into me, and he said, oh, thanks, Brother Goetsch. He said, you know, people tell me to trust the Lord. Trust the Lord. He said, I do, but I don't trust the devil. And it was things like that that he said to me over the years that began to form and fashion my life. I don't remember the year, but I was asked to come to Menominee Falls, Wisconsin, and preach at a preacher's meeting. I was only to speak once, one afternoon. They gave me a 3-hour session. Can you imagine? It was right after lunch, and it was the only session offered. They had to come. And I remember preaching that session, and they were weary. It had been, a lot of preaching all day, and in the evenings, a couple preachers, and I just had them that one session, and I tried everything to hold their attention. And finally, I dismissed them at 4 o'clock to go get a meal and get back for the great service that night. And really, my work was done. I was going to stay through the rest of the meeting, but my part was over. And all those men began going out the back, and I closed up my Bible and put away my notes. And I started off the platform, and everybody was going that way, except for one. He was in his 90s now, legally blind, struggling as he made his way from pew to pew. His wife already in heaven. He would go and join her in just a couple of weeks. He had that Bible open. And that steno notebook hanging out. It was Dr. Paul. I jumped off that platform. I ran to him. I said, Dr. Paul, I didn't know you were here. You know what he said? He didn't say, how you doing, Brother Goetsch? He pointed to that notebook. Now, he was legally blind. He had written in letters that were about 3 inches high. He pointed to that notebook, and he said, I missed letter E under point 5. What was letter E under point 5? And I'm thinking, you don't need it. I mean, you don't need it. You're going to go to heaven in 2 weeks. Just go over here and sit down and wait. I said, Dr. Paul, you don't need it. Tears began flowing down his face. He said, Brother Goetsch, write it in there for me. I want to be a better Christian. I want to love God more. I need letter E. That was Dr. Paul. We need a good dose of humility tonight. God's always in the humble place. But there's one more. In verse 8, I heard the voice of the Lord say, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then said I, here am I. Send me. God's always in the harvest place. When God seems absent, grab some tracts. Go find a street. Pass them out. He'll meet you there. Because he's all about the harvest place. That's why he came. When God seems absent, call the church office. Is there someone in the hospital I could go visit? Is there someone in the nursing home that needs some encouragement? Could I go? God's always in the harvest place. He's always in the ministry place. He'll meet you there. The Bible gives us the birth of Christ in all of the Gospels. It's a beautiful story that we dive into at Christmas time, and we learn those wonderful truths of his virgin birth and his early life. But then the Gospels go silent, and there's nothing. From the time he's a little over 2 to the time he starts his ministry, most would believe at around 30. There's nothing, except for one time. Do you remember it? He was 12 years old. And his parents took him up to Jerusalem to a feast. And they traveled with a group of people. We don't know exactly why. Maybe security, maybe accountability, maybe fellowship. But they make their way as a group, this 3-day journey up to Jerusalem, and they have a feast. They celebrate the feast. Now, they're returning home. Same group, traveling this 3-day journey home. And they got 1 day's journey home when they suddenly discovered we've lost God. How do you lose God? They lost him. Now, can you imagine this conversation? Mary says, Joseph, where's Jesus? I don't know, Mary. I thought he was with you. Oh, well, he's not with me, Joseph. I thought he was with you. When did you last see him? Back in Jerusalem. Back in Jerusalem? Joseph, that was 24 hours ago. Where is he? Oh, they panicked. Have you seen Jesus? Have you seen Jesus? Have anybody seen Jesus? And they realized they left him at church. So, boy, they hurried back to Jerusalem, and they found him. You remember where they found him? He was in the temple. And he was teaching the scholars. He was teaching the rabbinical scribes. He was teaching them as a 12-year-old boy. Now, the Bible is a book. You have to read a book. You can't go home and watch your Bible. You got to go home and read your Bible. The Bible's a book. You got to read it. But when you read it, you have to provide your own video. Because if you just read words, you don't get it all. Here's the words when Mary finds Jesus in the temple. Here's the words. Son, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. Where hast thou been? Those are the words. That wasn't the emotion. Can you imagine? Have you ever lost your kid at Walmart? Son, are you okay? We thought something terrible had happened. Son, are you all right? Oh, I'm so glad we found you. Where have you been? And you remember Jesus' response to his mother? How is it that you sought me? Wist you not that I must be about my Father's business? You should have known where to look. I'd be in the harvest place. I'd be in the ministry place. He's always there. Where's God? By the way, that girl I broke up with that day, we've been married 51 years now. But see, I wasn't ready for marriage as a junior in college. There was a lot of purging that had to happen in my life before I could enter into something as sacred as marriage. And those 6 days in that hotel room in Los Angeles, that door never opened. For 6 days, no one came in, no one went out. I never ate a bite of food. And I've been in thousands of revival meetings since, but I've never been in a more important one than that revival. Because it was just me and God in the humble place. See, when I came out of college, I was ready to preach in the stadiums. Lord, where's the stadium? I have 3 sermons. Bring them on. God said, no. We got to go to the humble place first. And that Monday morning behind my trailer in St. James, having a pity party, a car pulled in. An old 54 Ford car, old antique car. Behind the wheel was a man that in those parts they affectionately called Tiny. He weighed well over 400 pounds. Tiny was not a member of Manor Baptist Church. He lived 40 miles away. But he had been there the night before with his wife and 2 little girls. And after the service, he wanted to speak with my wife and I. And he and his wife, we sat on the front row. And with tears streaming down his face, he said, Brother Goetsch, this is the closest church to where we live that preaches the Bible. It's 80 miles for us to come. And we're worn out. Our little girls, it's too far. And we don't know what to do. We would plant a church, but we don't know anything about that. We don't know what to do. Can you help us? I didn't know much. But my wife and I, we put our arms around Tiny and his wife, and we prayed for him and tried to love him and wept with him about the need in their town. He drives in the parking lot. He sees me behind my trailer. He rolls down his window and he says, Brother Goetsch, do you need any food? Now, who just strolls into a church parking lot and asks a question like that? I put down my hose and my brush and I walked over to his car. I said, what are you talking about? He said, do you need any food? I said, well, sure. He said, get in the car. I got in the car. We started driving that 40 miles to his house. I said, Tiny, what's this about? He said, Brother Goetsch, I work for the Jolly Green Giant. I'm looking at this man, well over 400 pounds, and I'm thinking, are you the mascot or what do you do? I said, what do you do? He said, I'm an executive. I'm in management. He said, I walked out of my house this morning. I've got 4 freezers in my garage full of food. He said, we misprint stuff, we mispackage stuff. I bring it home, I throw it in those freezers. I walked out of my house into my garage to get in my car to go to work today, and he said, I wonder if that preacher's hungry. Now I'm sitting there thinking, this is great. This is awesome. But seriously, God, green beans? I mean, I'm hungry, but not for broccoli. Couldn't you speak to a beef farmer or somebody? We got to that house, he flipped up that garage door, and he opened those freezers, and I didn't know it, but Jolly Green Giant, they made lasagna. They made Swiss steak. He threw boxes and boxes into the back of that 54 Ford. We took it to the church. We filled the church freezer. We filled our freezer. We filled the pastor's freezer. By Friday night, we were giving free boxed food to anybody that would come and listen to me for 5 minutes. You know what God said? He said, son, you just stay on the front row ministering to people. I can feed you. Does God seem absent tonight? He's in the holy place. He's in the humble place. He's in the harvest place. He hasn't moved. we have. And tonight we need to come back to that place where God is.